What's up? Welcome to simulation. Yeah. Woo! Yeah, there's that excitement. There's that excitement. We're going to be learning. We're going to be learning. We're going to get inspired. We're going to be building the future with this amazing knowledge that we're going to be learning. So for all those who, how many of you guys have been to simulation before? Okay, maybe like 20 or so. And then those who have not, raise your hands. Yeah, okay, this is a good new audience. Awesome. Right. So simulation is rebirthing the public intellectual and inspiring you to build the future. We do so by putting together these multidisciplinary events and do a daily show as well in our recording studio on Market and 7th Street, where we feature all different subjects. We're talking AI and robotics, we're talking blockchain and cryptocurrency, biotech, neurotech, geopolitics, emotional intelligence, business. We talk about it all. And we are hopefully going to fill sports stadiums one day. Does that sound fun? Curious intellectuals for full day events. It'd be super cool. If like 22 football players can do it, so can a bunch of curious intellectuals, right? Yeah. Yeah, let's make that happen. Let's make that happen. So we are blessed to be at Werqwise's space. Their beautiful co-working space here. They're very technologically literate. They're constantly figuring out how to maximize the emotion of the space and the intellect of the space. And so without further ado, I want to bring Alan up for a little bit, the founder of Werqwise, to speak about it. And let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Alan. And welcome to Werqwise, everybody. It's only through partnerships with simulation and people like you guys that we can really achieve what we need to. Look, Werqwise is all about enabling the world to work wisely. We look at it a little differently, a little unconventionally. We all know that the world of work is changing. We're all seeing it, we're all experiencing it. It's changing in so many different ways. And science is giving us some pretty interesting insights that can be used to just help us stay ahead of that change, help us stay ahead of the curve. So what do we actually know? Well, we know that it's not just about space, no matter how you design it, or about collaboration. It's not just about technology. It's not just about interactions. It's not just about happiness. It's about these and so much more. It's about empowering you, empowering every person, and it's about empowering your workplace. And that's what we call working wisely. That's what we're here to do. So welcome, guys. Welcome, everybody. So keen to hear what you got to say tonight.
Yeah. Thank you.
Without further ado, over to you, Alan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alan. Definitely check them out, werqwise.com. All right. So, and now for the man of the hour, we have Dr. David Eagleman joining us, neuroscientist, author, adjunct professor at Stanford, an entrepreneur now of NeoSensory of BrainCheck. We have so much to talk about. Look at all those books. It took me so damn long to read them. And there's one in the very back that's like a collegiate level neuroscience book that's taken me it's such a really dense read. I love it so much. Let's give David Eagleman a huge round of applause and welcome.
Hey.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
All right. Hey, I want to say, by the way, I have so many friends that I've seen here tonight. New friends, old friends, and all the people I haven't yet met who will be future friends. So nice to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a freaking pleasure, David. You have no idea how inspirational you are to me. I'm just oozing with neuroscience knowledge thanks to you.
Right.
And it's so inspirational, and I think a lot of us have gotten just so super inspired by you, and it was so difficult putting together the notes to figure out where the hell to start with you. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So let's see how much we can do. We'll open it up for Q&A after a fireside chat. So I want to start maybe just by addressing a couple things that were on my mind about what I learned from you, and then I want to ask you kind of like a first powerful question. So this quote was at the beginning of Incognito. Man is equally incapable of seeing the nothingness from which he emerges and the infinity in which he is engulfed.
Yeah, that was Rene Descartes, and I've always been fascinated by this issue about the little strip of perception that we live on, which is to say, the way we perceive the world has everything to do with what is useful for us. So we perceive a little tiny strip of the electromagnetic spectrum, we perceive a little tiny strip of hearing frequencies that we can hear, and so on, things that are useful for finding food and mates and so on. But you know, what the last few centuries have taught us is what's going on in the world of, let's say, molecules and quantum mechanics and atoms and so on at one end, and at the other end of the scale, you know, the solar systems and galaxies and the cosmos. And it's very difficult for us as humans to really understand the world at either of those scales, even though that is just as much the reality as ours is, but we just happen to be in this little strip where we feel comfortable, and we have to work really, really hard to understand reality at those scales. So I really love that quotation from Descartes. Yeah.
And then it's like humans are right in the middle between the cosmic perspective and the molecular atomic perspective. We're like smack in the middle. You've right, visible light spectrums, all we see just this tiny little fraction of what actually exists. All these cell phone signals that are just going through you every single moment. There's so much more though that I want to just, even from the beginning here, you call yourself a possibilian, which I've said is a student of the universe. You're looking for what could be, for what can be.
Yeah, essentially the idea with possibilianism is simply, just in a few sentences, it's just that, you know, our choice seems to be when we come into the world is, okay, you can buy into a particular religious story, or you can do the thing where you say, you know, science has got all the answers, it's not that, I'm a strict atheist. And when you go into a bookstore, you see books on both of these sides, but I feel like as a scientist, I have to admit about the limits of our certainty and uncertainty. And so my interest is in building out the structure of the possibility space instead of fighting and dying for one particular story. Instead, figuring out like, okay, what could be, what are we doing here? What is going on? And so, you know, to my mind, that seems like a more modern approach rather than saying, well, I think this particular deity exists because my parents told me, or I think we've got it all figured out, there's no more mystery in the cosmos, because every good scientist will tell you that we don't understand even the basics. We don't know how consciousness arises from pieces and parts. We don't know how life started on Earth, the origin of life on Earth. You know, we have these stories like, well, maybe there was lightning and that caused amino acids to come into place, and then and then they started doing this thing and eventually got cells. But there's a whole narrative that we can spin, but we don't know if that's true, you know. So one of my mentors, Francis, what's that? Panspermia, exactly. So one of my mentors, Francis Crick, wrote a paper saying, you know, maybe life here on Earth was seeded from somewhere else, as in, you know, an asteroid came in and there was some life on the asteroid and so on.
We can't even figure out how our solar system evolved and produced life on Earth because it's so difficult to go back to understand how the solar system
exactly. And the cool part is the job of science is to, you know, make steps forward, and we do that every year. It's just that there's the distance that we have to cover and the distance that we're going to cover in our lifetimes. There's just a giant difference there. So, so even at the end of my life, I know I will be stuck with all of these uncharted waters. And so that's the idea with possibilianism is, let's not fight and die for a particular story, but just try to figure out what is possible. And I just want to say, the job of science is to rule things out and to open up new folds in the possibility space that we hadn't thought of before. So it's not, possibilianism is not anything goes or anybody's story gets equal weight or something. It's just that everything gets put on the wide, you know, science has a wide table for accepting hypotheses when we don't know what the right answer is.
Then you sat down with Sadhguru as well in a conversation, and he's a mystic and a yogi, and the way that he speaks about things is it's different in a sense. It's much more, you know, spiritually inclined in that sense, and these are things that it's more difficult for science to objectively quantify, these types of things. And so being a possibilian is like just saying that also that I'm not going to subscribe to a binary sort of thinking. I'm going to find all this nuance. I'm going to find what all the possibility is, and I'm going to keep exploring. I'm going to keep exploring and being a student. This was quite interesting for me. In Runaway Species kind of excited this thought process in me that we are now in control of Earth. We're now in control of this rock, and we're a little bit more algorithmically advanced than other species are. And it used to take 30 years to travel from New York City to LA. You would die on the way. And now it takes 5 hours in a plane. And if the plane is delayed, we're like, oh, I can't believe my plane's delayed. And we've kind of grown to these standards that you couldn't talk to someone on the other side of the earth a couple hundred years ago. Now you can, and if the video chat or the Wi-Fi or data signal's failing a bit, you're pissed off. Now, as we see ourselves in control of this earth, we have to figure out how to work together. We have to figure out how to communicate more effectively, how to collaborate more effectively, how to inspire the next generations of thinkers and doers and kids. And then in the brain, the idea of you sitting here right now, there will never be anybody else quite like you, ever. And the general idea is just that you specifically have had all of the interactions that you've had from your birth until where you are now, family, friends, coworkers, etc., in all these specific ways, and there will never be anybody else quite like that. And you kind of paint this picture of going from stardust to evolution to your mother and father, their mother and father, father and mother, all the way down to you. And they all had to have sex. Successfully have sex to bring you into this world today. And yeah, and when you say, you know, oh, what's your name? My name's Alan. Your brain physically changes to remember that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, sorry. When you tell me your name, my brain changes.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So when you tell me David, my brain physically changes. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the thing, your brain is changing all the time, and we don't know how to build tech like this. We build software and hardware, but my next book is called Livewire, in which I suggest the term Liveware for what's going on upstairs here, because it's just this constantly reconfiguring system. That's what learning and memory is. It's changes across these vast seas of synapses. Synapses are where two neurons connect, and you've got about 1,000 trillion of those, and they can have any strength between weak and strong. And so it's this whole pattern that ends up determining all of your memories, who you think you are, your language, everything about your culture, all that stuff is stored in there. What's weird is that we don't know how to read that out, and we probably won't for 100 or 200 years, but...
Is that a Markov model?
It's not. No, it's not random. It's very,
interesting.
Presumably it's deterministic, and it's extremely specific.
Markov model preserves state. So if you're saying like everything that we've done preserves state as of where we are now, is that a Markov model?
Markov models are memoryless.
I'm not trying to like antagonize right now. I'm actually just curious.
Yeah, good question. Markov models are memoryless, and the brain is just the opposite, which is you actually, the whole trick with plasticity is that you're cementing in particular states and you're keeping those. So just as an example, if you can remember the name of your 5th grade teacher all these years later, it's because that state got put into place and that's kept there. And that's kept there even while other things still retain plasticity and they can still move around.
Yeah. And what is that?
It's Liveware. I mean, we don't build things like that. And by the way, one of the things about living in the valley is, you know, kind of every day or so, someone says, hey, I've come up with this AI company and it operates on the principles that the brain does because we have neurons, and neurons are connected by axons, and we change the synapse, and it's all bullshit because it's not how the brain works, because we don't actually know.
Yeah, please, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem. But in answer to your question about what is that, that's the whole point, is we don't know yet. We can't build companies that operate on those principles because we don't have those yet. That's what we're working on.
And it's so fascinating the way that neural architecture forms up until the age of 2. And then what happens afterward, and this whole selective process of whatever inputs that you take in ossify, solidify, and then other ones prune out, and they go away over time, whichever ones you end up prioritizing or deprioritizing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just want me to say what the thing is, or you just want to leave it?
Why don't you, go for it.
Oh, it's, what Alan's referring to is simply that you're born with a fixed number of neurons, but they start connecting more and more and more, so you get more synapses, more connections between these things. and it gets denser and denser until you're about 2 years old. And then the trick after that is a pruning of the garden, and you're actually just reducing, you're just losing synapses after that. But nonetheless, you get to be an adult. You know lots of stuff, and you remember all kinds of experiences. But it's a pruning. It's not what gets added to your brain. It's what gets taken away that matters. So keep going. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
That's exactly this whole, and we'll touch on molding neural architecture, molding child development a little bit later. I want to make sure we touch on this. But you wrote there are as many connections in a cubic centimeter in brain as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So just a tiny little cubic centimeter, and that's 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion connections, as many stars as there are in the galaxy. And there's all this crazy way that, that we become who we become. And this is everything from I want to talk about these experiments, because I think these are things that we typically don't really realize, but, and these aren't, sometimes they're not even experiments, they're accidentals. There was the group of 170,000 Romanian orphan children. And that was because of a celibacy tax, that if you didn't procreate, they wanted to increase the amount of population there. If you didn't procreate, then you would get taxed, and they would go and make sure that you're procreating. And so a lot of people had too many kids that they couldn't feed and take care of, and then those kids went into the orphanages. And then they were deprived before the age of 2 of these important social connections and important just ways that they cognitively develop. And then now we see a lot of the issues in terms of their cognition and their social ability. And you wrote about this, and it was very fascinating. There's another example after this I want to hit, but what do you like?
Yeah, it's just, it's critically important that kids get things like touch and speech and so on. Babies get this because that's how essentially the human brain drops into the world kind of half-baked. Unlike other, if you ever see a giraffe get born, or a cow or a dolphin or whatever, after 30 minutes they're walking around, or the dolphin is swimming around and so on. But human babies, if you guys have ever seen one, don't do that after 30 minutes. And so the question is, why do humans take so long to develop compared to every other species?
Yep.
And it's because of this issue that we drop out half-baked, and that has really been the secret that's led to our species success, because what we're able to do is absorb the culture around us, and specifically absorb all the learnings that have happened so far. So an alligator now is exactly like an alligator a million years ago. There hasn't been sort of a building alligator literature or science that they can step out on top of. But that's what we get to do. But anyway, with the Romanian orphans, it turned out that there were too many in these orphanages, and so the thinking that they were being helpful, the people who worked there said, look, don't pick them up and don't talk to them, because then they cry more when you put them down, so just don't bother doing that. And what happened is this whole generation of children didn't develop correctly. They've got deep cognitive problems. So it's been one of these, Mother Nature's cruel experiments where you get to see the consequences of this sort of thing.
And then there's another really insanely interesting example with Whitman, who was just a normal guy, cared about his family, cared about his work, and then all of a sudden was having a tumor press against his amygdala in his brain, and that caused him, right, this is biology that caused him to go out and murder his wife and his wife's mother, and then 13 people, and just again, this is another whole, we'll touch on some of the more free will determinism stuff, but that just blows my mind that you can just be pushed by a tumor into that kind of crazy, you lose control.
Right, so for those of you who don't know, Charles Whitman was the guy who almost exactly 50 years ago climbed up the tower at the University of Texas at Austin and did what was essentially America's first mass shooting. And he murdered lots of people. He murdered 16, and then 39 people were wounded. And it was just a completely random act of violence. He was shooting pedestrians and the people that came to help them, and the ambulance drivers that came to help them. It was this horrible act, and right. And so by the time the deputies got to the top of the tower and were able to kill him, immediately what everyone wanted to know is, who is this guy? And it turned out the interesting part of the story is that Whitman wanted to know the same answer. He was extreme, he was high IQ and articulate, and he kept a diary for a year before this, monitoring and describing the changes that he was feeling in himself, about how he was becoming more and more angry. He had this anger, he had this aggression. So he went to a psychiatrist, but this was in 1966. And, there was no brain scanning or anything like that. And, he talked to the psychiatrist. He didn't get any meaningful help there. And so, he monitored this whole thing. And then he wrote a suicide note on his typewriter the night before where he said, when this is all over, I want an autopsy to be performed. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how they found the tumor. Yeah.
And then the this one as well.
Actually, wait, can I say one other thing?
Please.
This is what leads to. I mean, this is one story of a gajillion stories that teach us that you are your biology, and when your biology changes, you change. And of course, when people go and drink wine, or you do drugs, or you are on prescription medications, or whatever the thing is, that changes who you are, how you decide, how you act. And this is the sense in which we are slaves to our biology, and that's sort of an interesting note, but where that really matters is with the legal system. This is, as we gain an increasing understanding of this really strains our intuitive notions about, okay, well, that guy's guilty, and all I want is, bloodlust. It's totally natural. We just feel bloodlust. We want to punish someone who breaks the rules. Totally natural. And universal. But as we come to understand more and more about brain function and all the ways that things can go wrong, and the number of brains that can be standing in front of the judge's bench, like this guy's got schizophrenia, this guy's got psychopathy, this guy's tweaked on drugs, this guy, blah, blah, blah. All these things, it complexifies the system in a very interesting way, and I think I know the solution to how we can solve that, but what we have a lot here is mandated sentencing, where we say, okay, look, you committed this crime, that's 5 years. And the idea is that pays off dividends in fairness. You're just treating everybody the same. But it actually does not make sense to treat everybody the same.
If all these brains are unique.
Exactly. Because the rehabilitative strategies that are available are quite different for these things.
And the recidivism rate, I think, was 77% go back within 5 years.
Yeah, it totally depends on the type of crime. But yes, on average, it's about that.
And that's horrible. And we're not doing a good enough job at figuring out.
Exactly. Because what we do in this country, and pretty much worldwide also.
One more thing, that if a judge right before lunch is giving out parole, you're less likely to get parole than if the judge has eaten lunch. Then you're more likely to get parole. So it's
the rest is not. Okay. So it turns out that.
And you spend a fourth of your time doing neurolaw.
Yeah, exactly. So I run the Center for Science and Law, which is a national nonprofit.
Yep, I forgot to mention that one at the beginning.
Predicated on this issue, yeah. How do we actually improve the justice system? And so
Scilaw.org.
Yeah, scilaw.org, as in science and law. Yeah, exactly. So I'll just mention one thing, which is so simple, which several counties have done this now, but only when they run out of money. They want to build a new prison. Their prison is overstuffed. They just can't figure out how to stuff all these prisoners in. They can't afford a new prison. And so that's when they start trying to think of smarter ideas. So the smarter idea that several counties have done now is make specialized court systems where you have a mental health court where the judges and juries have expertise in this kind of thing. They know what schizophrenia is, as opposed to, by the way, lots of jurors say, well, that's bullshit. I think he's just making that up. It's just an excuse, whatever. So you have expertise on mental illness and on the rehabilitative strategies that are available. You have drug courts where the judge and juries know about, there are so many rehabilitative strategies for drug addiction, from the pharmacological to different neuroimaging techniques that I'm working on and others. And so you don't have to take somebody who's in there for 2 ounces of marijuana or whatever the drug is and incarcerate them and think that that's going to somehow do them good.
Totally. Yeah. And you were talking about how the brain can actually, over time, adapt in such fascinating ways depending on what you're learning. This example, there's this thing called the knowledge. And that is 24,000 streets and 50,000 places of interest that a London taxi cab driver has to memorize. And they're studying this 3 to 4 hours per day of just reciting simulated routes of them having to drive. And when you look at their brain in neuroimaging, you can see that their hippocampus is larger.
Yeah, exactly. And this, in a sense, is a cool example, and it's no surprise, which is to say, if you dedicate yourself to a particular task, we can very often see physical changes in the structure of your brain. Just as an example, if you take up juggling, I can see changes in your brain. If I look at a brain, I can tell whether you are a piano player or a violin player. Just because with a violin you're using detailed hand motions with one hand but not the other. With a piano you're using both, and that causes changes in the motor cortex that I can just look at and see. So you have really big architectural changes in the brain based on what you do and of course what your goals are and so on.
There's some, David Wynn played against like a 10-year-old cup stacker.
Yeah, the world champion cup stacker.
The world champion cup stacker. And it's so fascinating how the neuroimaging on the 10-year-old cup stacker, it was all unconsciously going on. There was basically no neural signatures in his brain while he was doing this. And then David was basically consciously trying to figure out how to cup stack, and his brain was just firing a crapload trying to figure out how to maximize.
And this is the general story, is that when you're consciously attending to something, you have to burn a lot of energy to figure it out. And what the brain is always trying to do is automatize things, is take things that you're doing over and over and figure out how to burn it into the circuitry of the brain so that then you can do it, quickly and efficiently.
Oh man, I love this. No one like you has ever existed. No one like you will ever exist again. It's so interesting. Okay, so you have a theory. It's called potato head theory. I love potato head theory. So the brain is caged inside of darkness, and the nose, eyes, ears, just like a potato head, you just plug them on here, and then you're transmitting sensory inputs, and you're coding it, and your brain is decoding and understanding what the sensory input is. And so your idea with NeoSensory is that you can take someone that's deaf, this massive amount of people that are hard of hearing on the planet, and you can augment their senses and perception by putting on what you have right now, which is Buzz, which is this wristband that you wear that has motors on it, or a vest, which you're also wearing, that has motors on it, that vibrate with the pattern of the voice or with the pattern of a dog barking or someone knocking or someone that is a smoke alarm going off, and then that will give them greater environmental awareness. And so this is your first entrepreneurial endeavor, and your quote to me was like, or the quote online was, 120 scientific articles, 6 people can read them and understand them, but as an entrepreneur I can hit 130 million people that are deaf across the world. And that is like the power of entrepreneurship and having science marry itself with entrepreneurship on the planet. So yeah, NeoSensory, you're wearing it right now. It's an amazing endeavor. I was blessed to go down to Palo Alto and see it. I loved it down there. I was just oozing again with feelings of inspiration. So yeah, tell us more about NeoSensory and
NeoSensory. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, by the way, I didn't say that only 6 people on the planet could understand my papers. It's that only 6 people on the planet bother to read them. And so that's that's why I want
6 people bother to read them.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. And this is true of science papers in general. And so, yeah, I mean, because at this point there are 30,000 papers coming out in the neuroscience field every month. And it's totally impossible to keep up with the literature. And so, anyway, right, I realized at some point that moving in the entrepreneurial route would have a much different kind of impact. So, right, what Alan said is, because the brain is locked in silence and darkness inside the skull, it doesn't know where all these signals are coming from. All it knows is that it's received these different patterns, and it can correlate them with other patterns, and that's how it puts together your perception of the world. So as far as you are concerned, you're seeing, light and color, and you're hearing things and so on. But inside your brain, it's all just spikes. It's these neurons, these 86 billion neurons, that are just popping off, and that's all that happens. And so what I really started chewing on about 10 years ago is this issue of, could you feed in a different data source of information through a different channel, and the brain just incorporates that into its senses. And so yeah, that's what caused us to build these things. So many of you have seen this before, but like, so this is for, I'm sitting on it wrong, so I knocked the battery out, but I'll plug this back. But yeah, so we built this vest with vibratory motors all over it, and the vest can translate sound. So this is picking up sound here, and it can translate that into patterns of vibration. Can you? I don't know if you're able to see through the shirt here. Can you guys see that there are lights turning on here? Okay, if not, then I'll be wearing this afterwards. But anyway, the point is, sound is getting turned into patterns of vibration all over my torso. And deaf people can come to understand this, and it's actually quite easy. And the reason is, all your inner ear is doing is capturing sound on the eardrum, and then the inner ear busts that into different frequencies and sends it off to the brain in patterns of spikes. And that's all we're doing here. We're just capturing sound, breaking into frequencies, sending it to the brain, in this case through the skin. And it's very easy for the brain to figure it out. So one of the things we do is we do science experiments on day one on people the very first time they're wearing this, or the wristband is actually what we've moved to. It's actually, it looks like this. And on day one, people are really good at being able to distinguish, okay, bzz, 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 was that the sound of a dog barking or a baby crying, a door slamming, or, a siren, or a, whatever it is. Anyway, people are really good at that. So it's surprisingly intuitive. We've tested 597 people now with deafness or various degree of hearing loss, and people really dig it.
Their testimonials are profound, and they make you really realize that we are not going to wait any longer for biology. It's time to figure out how to add these senses, substitute these senses, augment these senses. Yeah. Exactly. And so that's why I started this company, NeoSensory, is exactly for that. So deafness is our it's our clear market path, because it's a very meaningful market for us to hit. From a business point of view, it's a large market also. But the part I'm really excited about is what comes next, all the things that we're doing next. Because you can actually feed in any kind of data stream and come to develop a direct perceptual experience of that. So we've done things with drone pilots, for example, where we're feeding the pitch, yaw, roll, heading and orientation of the drone into the vest. We've done things with prosthetic legs where somebody obviously can't feel your prosthetic leg. So we put pressure and angle sensors in, and then you can feel that and learn how to walk well with it. We're doing things with artificial sense of smell. The reason you carry a smell dog around when you're a DEA guy or something is because dogs have really big snouts and lots of smell, and we have very pitiful noses. And so, but it's easy enough to build a molecular odor detector and hook that up. Doing things with surgeons so they can feel stuff while they're doing an operation. Anyway, we've got lots and lots of projects going on. The thing I'm building right now, which is sort of secret, but it doesn't much matter, is multi-spectral imaging, which means being able to see with detectors into different parts of the EM spectrum. So, infrared and ultraviolet, but also other more interesting parts of the spectrum. Because honeybees see ultraviolet, and then rattlesnakes see infrared, exactly right. But even ultraviolet and infrared ranges are huge. There's all kinds of different places you can see in there. Yeah. And so anyway, I want to walk around in other parts of the spectrum besides just a little visible light spectrum. And the cool part is, I probably mentioned this to you, I think there are probably 25 Nobel Prizes waiting to be found in different parts of the spectrum because nobody, we have technologies to image there, but typically the only things that people image are those things in a laboratory where you take something in, you image it carefully or whatever. But what nobody's done is walked around in the world and just experienced these different parts of the spectrum while they're walking around and say, "Whoa, that's weird." Yeah. So that's the next 3 years for me. Yeah, and there's huge, like you said, potential with potentially Nobel Prizes that could be given for those things. And actually us, for ones that aren't hard of hearing, can also explore NeoSensory recreationally, and we can do things like feel what's going on Twitter on your body. Yeah. And some people definitely don't want to do that for many reasons. Yeah. We did something, just as a proof of principle, we did an automated sentiment analysis where you look for a particular hashtag, let's say a very popular hashtag, and then in every moment we're looking at whether people are saying good, bad, or neutral things about it. You can do these automated sentiment analysis. Like Trump, for example, you can feel on your body how the US is thinking or how the world is. Exactly right. Any hashtag you want to look at, you can say like, oh, good, oh, bad, you can figure out what's going on that way. So that was just a proof of principle. There are much deeper levels that we can go with that. I just haven't found a business case yet why we would do that with Twitter, but it was a cool proof of principle. I think it'd be interesting for a politician. It'd be interesting for a politician to give a speech and in real time sort of feel how it's landing. Like, I'm being televised to millions of people.
And as I'm saying, you know, whoa, this little thing I'm saying about tax is not going so well. Oh, this thing I'm saying about this is going real well.
Yeah.
Anyway.
There's another aspect to that that's super important, which is that when you're given the vest to wear or the buzz, when you're given one of those two, and then you're learning. You have to learn how it works on your body and how to and you start at a 50-50 accuracy because you're seeing the word dog or cup. And you feel it, and then you click dog, and you were wrong. And then next time you just keep building and building on that, and after about a week of just guessing until learning and learning and learning, and then all of a sudden you're actually fluent in how something vibrates, and I can tell that you said the word dog, or I can tell you said the word cup.
Yeah, it's actually what's interesting is people get better and better every day, but I just want to point out this one interesting fact. It's a linear process as opposed to having a jump. So there's no moment where you suddenly get better, because that is actually the signature of conscious learning, as in, oh, I've just figured it out. But what's interesting here is it's all unconscious learning, because it's too complicated. It's actually exactly the way that a baby learns how to use her ears, right? A baby does things, like babbles and vocalizes, and the ear's picking up on that, and the baby learns through time, how the ear works, and it's exactly what we're doing here. Question?
I had a question for you. You said it was a linear process instead of an exponential one. When you say it, what are you describing? Because if you're describing
let me just tell you what I'm describing. I'm describing the performance, how well people do on the task.
And the reason why it's linear is because it's random over time.
Well, it's just, this is the signature of unconscious learning, is that you just get better and better at something. What's that?
It's exponential.
The point is it's linear, it's not exponential. The point, when you have I don't want to spend more time on this, but when you have a conscious thing where you go, oh, I get the trick, then you have this jump in your performance, and that's what never happens.
So okay, I really think this is important to cover. We asked this question as trivia at the beginning. So how many billions of neuronal cells are there? Okay, there's 86 billion. And then I asked the question, well, how many glial cells are there? Because a glial cell has this fascinating functionality in the brain, and we don't recognize it. So often people are only talking neurons, but glial cells are fascinating as well, in my opinion. And then the most recent literature that I saw was 86 billion as well, glial cells. And they have functionalities ranging from maintaining homeostasis, supplying nutrients and oxygen, holding the neurons in place, protecting them, insulating them, destroying pathogens, removing dead neurons.
All true. The reason people are less interested in glial cells is because all of their signals are running at a much slower level. So the thing that's interesting about neurons is they're popping off these signals called spikes. They're a binary signal. It's like zeros and ones. So neurons pop off these spikes, which travel at several meters per second, and a given neuron will pop off like 10 to 100 times per second. So all of the fast information in the brain, it's all neurons. So if I throw a ball to you and you catch it, all neurons. So that's why people are slightly less interested in glial cells, although they're interesting for sort of the long-term maintenance of things.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense with neuronal cells being at this, why people care about them more. Still exciting though to explore. They provide the myelin sheath. There's so many other amazing aspects to it. Okay, so how about we talk about thought origination? This is interesting that by the time that I become conscious of a thought, I am already in the past. The thought at t0, I only become aware of it, what is it, half a second later, 500 milliseconds?
Well, let's be careful. So it's not necessarily a thought, but it's your, like what happens. So I clap my hands and I'm aware of the sound and the sight and the feeling of it. But yeah, that's already happened well in the past because my visual system captures that, my somatosensory system feels it, my auditory system captures the sound of it. And all these things have, even though I mentioned that neurons run fast, they're not that fast, so these signals have to move around, and we've got particularly big brains for our size. That's what makes our species really special. So these signals move around, and then they have to get all stitched together in these multi-sensory areas of the brain, saying, oh, there was some sound, there was some sight, there's some feeling. And then finally we say like, oh, I got it. I just heard a hand clap, but it's already happened a long time ago. So the thing I often say about this is it's like your perception is, it's like Saturday Night Live, which is not actually live. Saturday Night Live is aired with a delay in case somebody cusses or falls down or something like that. And so that's what your perceptual world is like. You're living in the past. When you think the moment now occurs, it's already happened a long time ago.
And the reality is just inside of our head. Is everything that we're perceiving is just right inside of us. And so,
and can I mention one more thing, which is I have a hypothesis that I still haven't figured out exactly how to prove it yet, but I have a hypothesis that tall people live farther in the past than short people, because you have to wait for all the signals to get to your brain. So if you want to have a unified perception, for example, if I touch my toe and my nose at the same time, the signals from my toe get to my brain essentially right away, but for my toe, it has to, thank you, it has to climb all the way up the spinal cord to get to your brain, and that takes some hundreds of milliseconds longer. So if you're really tall, like my friend Will, then they have to, he'll get that in a minute from now.
In a minute, yeah. Got it.
So, yeah, anyway, so if you want to have a unified perception of your whole body, so I have a hypothesis, and I'm trying to figure out how to hook up with like the zoo, the local zoo, to test this, because I think elephants probably live really far in the past.
Yes.
Because if you touch an elephant on the back of his foot, you know, it's got a long way to travel to get to the elephant's brain. But like, you know, a small
second and a half,
creature-
maybe?
Oh, it's not that long. It's not that.
Okay.
Probably 500 milliseconds.
Okay.
But for, you know, a small creature like a bird or something, you touch it, bang, you know, and you guys have noticed this, if you try to swat a fly or something, they're a lot faster than you are. I mean, they can see the slow human doing their thing, and they're like, all right, you know. They fly away and they do whatever. But it's because, I think it's because their brains are so small, so the signals can get around. Okay, fine, here's what to do, and then it goes. Yeah. So yeah, I think, you know, I'm actually, my next book is about reality. It's called Windows on Reality, and it's about how all these different creatures, how we all see reality so differently. But I think this is a really important point, is about the size of the creature experiences a different reality in time, which actually led me to think of something random, which is, what if we do discover life on other planets eventually, and might we find that creatures live at different time scales than we do? For example, like, let's say you discovered a planet of trees. That's a totally different time scale. I mean, let's say we conclude that they're trees, but in fact they're not trees. They just run on a very different time scale. They're much slower. Or conversely, we find a planet full of super fast creatures that move so fast we don't even recognize anything's happening. We're the tree creatures to them. Anyway.
Yeah, and we'll be unpacking some as well. Some.
That's what I call it.
And in some, David goes through the 40 stories of basically simulations. And and collectors. I like the word collectors that you used in there. We'll go through that. I just want to see what your thoughts are here about where exactly and how exactly the initial thought forms. There's all of the experiments about I'm wearing an EEG and I'm looking at a button, and then I move to hit the button, but the button turns red before I hit it. And the fact that I'm being red and the button's changing the color is happening faster than I can move to hit the button. So, and there's other examples like this as well, and just like thought originates, and then we become aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, the general story is that the part of you that is conscious is the smallest part of what's going on in the brain, and almost everything is run under the hood. And so, the general emerging lesson has been that consciousness is the last guy on the ladder to get any information. And this is the big question in neuroscience, is the way it's phrased is, does consciousness have efficacy? By which that means, when I think something consciously, does that actually feed back and change something about the system? Or is consciousness an epiphenomenon, which means it's the last guy to get the data, and it doesn't even matter what it thinks, because everything is running under the thing. So the experiments that Alan's referring to have to do with, you can measure often what somebody is going to do before they do it, just before they do it. So even though they think, okay, look, I'm going to lift my finger at a time of my choosing. Okay, that was the time of my own choosing. But in fact, you can measure in the brain the buildup of signals that happen just before that. And so if you answer, you're watching a clock, and you say, okay, this is exactly the moment that I decided to lift my finger. In fact, from the EEG signal, for example, that they decided a little bit before, their brain decided before they did. So this is an area that we don't actually know the final answer to in neuroscience, but the question is, do we have free will? Question in the back.
Yeah.
From the tall guy, so maybe it's an old question. Yeah.
Give it a yell.
No, just shout.
You shout for now.
I'll shout and I'll repeat.
We have a mic. Go ahead. There's a mic. Yep.
Great. I think the question's something around what you're saying. Oh, sorry. I've got it now. So, it's a question we had a little bit earlier when we were talking about the difference between, thank you, the difference between your subjective experience and then these weird phenomena that happen where it's intersubjective, or the thing about this the collective experience. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how that fits into our temporal frame, because there's something about those deep thinking on the collective level that feel like they're in a different temporal frame than in just a purely subjective. So in a way it feels that I feel like there are people who are very tuned to the feeling of this whole room, as opposed to me that's somewhere between the two. I have a sense of this whole room, but I'm really dominated by my own subjective experience. And I wonder whether there's something around their temporal frame which is different, in the same way as you're saying with the fly versus the human. Is there a possibility that the temporal frame could be different if you're dealing with an intersubjective versus a subjective?
That's an interesting question. I would say there's absolutely no data on that. Intuitively, I would say that probably the temporal frame is just as slow. And what Will is referring to in part of the question is a completely wacky, stupid idea that I was talking about earlier today, which is just something I'm thinking about, which is if two people are having a conversation, they're really deep in conversation, let me back up one step, which is to say, one of the things I wrote at length about in Incognito is the way that your brain is a team of rivals. You've got all these different neural networks that have different drives, they want different things, and it's always a machine built of conflict. So, if you put some chocolate cake in front of me, part of me wants to eat it, part of me doesn't want to eat it, part of me feels socially bound not to get up and go to get the chocolate cake, and so on. Or I might say, okay, I'll eat the chocolate cake, but I'll promise to go to the gym tomorrow, or whatever. You've got all these competing voices. Okay, so what I was wondering is when two people are engaged in deep conversation, is there essentially now not just 3 pounds of brain tissue, but 6 pounds of brain tissue, and there's like a mega brain that's connected by this very thin bandwidth of communication, but nonetheless, it's like one brain, especially if we're really into something together. And the intersubjective that Will's referring to is, like if there's a whole room of people, some people really attuned to that, and this is just an open question that, of course, I don't know the answer to, but, is there something like
a collective hive mind of
a collective hive mind of all these brains, and could that hive mind actually have an unconscious, by which I simply mean it's aware of things that none of us as individuals are aware of, but you need that sort of thing, yeah. So anyway, that's already so speculative but interesting, but I don't know if there's a difference in the temporal the speed or the frame of it. Yeah,
that's going to be a good Q&A if we bring that up again. So check this out. Here are some things that we typically don't think about. If I'm holding a warm cup of coffee and I'm asked about my relationship with my mother, I'm more likely to say that I have a good relationship. If I'm holding an iced coffee, I'm more likely to say that it's not so good. If you smell something that's foul when you're walking around, you're more likely to have like a lower moral standard.
Harsher moral decisions.
Harsher moral decisions. There's so many things like this. You just talked about the argument that you have in your mind about eating cake or not, if you're sleepy but have an important deadline. So there's all of these sorts of things about kind of the way that unconscious, the autonomic nervous system as well, the way that we blink, the way that we breathe, these sort of functionalities that we don't have to think about, the way that we walk. It's really nice to not have to think about every step that you take. So then there's like this, there's the CEO in the process, and that's the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of the conscious mind, and then that's observing and waiting for if there's something that's thrown out of the blue, and then it has to reorganize and make sure that go ahead and
yes, the conscious mind I assert exists to arbitrate conflict, and so I actually suggest in the book that this could, if that's right, it gives us a way to measure degrees of consciousness among animals. In the sense, people always ask this question, like, is my dog conscious? Is my pet gerbil conscious? And so on. And the trend in neuroscience used to be to say, okay, well, we know we're conscious, but the gerbil is not conscious or something. But more recently, it's this idea that there's a spectrum, and maybe the gerbil is less conscious, sort of a lower resolution consciousness. Like if you take off your glasses at night and you're sort of squinting around, maybe that's what it's like to be the gerbil. Like, oh, this is good, this is bad, but it's kind of low res. Yeah. We don't know if any of this is true. What I'm writing about my next book, Livewire, is that I think probably it's just a very different kind of content. As opposed to being on a spectrum, if you have different senses and you're tapped into the olfactory world or whatever, it's probably just very, very different. But so the idea that I suggest, though, is that looking at how well an animal can arbitrate conflict might be a good measure of how conscious it is. Just as an example, if you take a rat and you put cheese at the end of a maze arm, the rat will run towards the cheese, and you can put a little harness on the rat and measure how hard he's pulling towards the cheese. Okay, now let's say you put an electric shock at the end of the maze. You can measure how hard the rat runs away and measure with a little harness the force with which he's pulling away. So now let's say you put cheese and electric shock there. What happens is the rat gets stuck running in a circle at exactly the point in the maze that you would predict from looking at where the two forces cancel out. In other words, the rat has two programs running at the same time, saying, go to the cheese, run away from the shock, at the same time, and he gets confused, and he can't arbitrate that.
Yep.
There's a bird called the stickleback gull, which...
it's like when you can't pick that pair of jeans at the store.
Well, but eventually you can, right, as a human.
What about the rat?
There's this bird that if you give it anything egg-shaped, it will sit on it. And if you give it anything red, it will attack it. And so if you give it a red egg, it will sit on it and attack it at the same time because it just doesn't have... So anyway, this is where I think consciousness comes in, is arbitrating these separate votes in the brain.
I wonder how many more examples there are like that. Just freaking blow our perception away. So recently I've been learning more about the microbiome, and microbiome is just this crazy place of bacterial cells, 40 trillion of them, more than there are human cells, more genetic expressions than there are human expressions in the body. Bacterial cells are billions of years old, human cells are less old, and just all of this crazy information, and just thinking about how much our microbiome controls the decision to get up and go get a banana, or to pick a banana over an apple, or a bag of chips over either one of those two, or when to eat, and all these other sorts of thoughts. So kind of all these different variables tie into where does thought originate, how does the microbiome play into this, and into...
Yeah, the general story is, there's a huge highway of connections that goes back and forth between the brain and the gut.
The vagus nerve?
Yeah, exactly. So you've got many millions of neurons that are communicating between these things. We don't actually know what this means yet. The general story, the general story is this: the brain is the densest representation of who you are. And the reason we know that is because when the brain gets damaged, that changes you in ways that are big. So like, if I lose my leg by stepping on an explosive device or something, I get a prosthetic leg, I'm really no different except for the trauma of the event. I'm not a different person. But if I damage a tiny little chunk of brain tissue, that can change me entirely. With a stroke or a tumor or traumatic brain injury or whatever, that's how we know that this is a dense representation of who you are as a person. Then the question is, what about the immune system, the microbiome, all these things that communicate with this, hormones and so on. The general story is I see this as being like the main city, like this is New York City, and this is kind of the greater metropolitan area. This does have an influence, but when you look at, let's say, the economy of New York City or something, it's mostly taking place up here, but there's a little bit of influence of this other stuff.
Yeah, and then, you made that point when you were looking over the cityscape, and you were indicating that these are the different networks, Chinatown and all these different city centers, but they all work together as one massive brain.
Well, exactly. I was making a slightly different, Alan's referring to my television show, The Brain. There's a scene where I'm standing on a building overlooking a city, and I'm just pointing out the issue there of this temptation that people often have to say, oh, where's the spot in the brain for empathy, for generosity, for whatever? But the fact is there is no single spot in the brain. So the point I was making there is what if you looked at a city and you said, okay, well, where is the economy located? The answer is there is no spot in the city. It's an emergent property of all of the interactions in the city. And that's what essentially everything interesting in the brain is. So that's why these are fool's errands to try to figure out, okay, what's the spot in the brain for fill in the blank?
But like taking out the port or taking out the Chinatown or whatever would be crazy in this process of taking out the economy.
Well, no, so this is the thing that happens is that sometimes, so let's say you bombed a city and let's say you were a blind airplane bomber and you bombed the runway of a city. Then you'd say, hey, I found the spot for the economy because now there's no planes leaving, the economy is tanking, so I must have found that runway is the spot where the economy is located.
But
it's actually not.
Runway, right?
What's that?
The brain would make a new
Well,
runway.
that's a separate point. We'll get to that in a second. But the point is, this happens a lot with brain damage where people will say, oh, we know the area in the brain for blah, because when that area gets damaged, you lose blah. But it doesn't mean that's where that's located even. It just means that that's the runway that you need for all this other stuff to work. Yeah.
I want to talk about time and time perception. You fell off of a roof. Was it like a 10-foot roof or so when you
12
were
foot.
12-foot roof when you were 8 years old?
Yeah.
And you had a different perception of time. And there's so many other instances, like I've had my own scenarios like this where time seemed to have slowed down and I was able to take a long time to make a calculated decision on how to save my body from being injured. There's the wingsuit guy that was flying down that hit the rock, and it felt like such a long time for him to make the decision of being able to pull his parachute and still, break his leg and everything, but still live. So time and the way that time gets, I guess, morphed. If you do things that are repetitive, when we do things that are novel, we create new flows of connections in our mind. So again, it's like doing novel things does something to our perception of time as well. So yeah, unpack. You're studying time perception, so interesting.
So yeah, just very briefly, right, I was very interested in this since the time I fell off the roof, and I got lots, over the years I collected lots of reports from people who had said that something seemed to have taken a long time, like a car accident or something. But I realized there was nothing in the literature that had ever put this to the test. Like, do people actually see in slow motion during a high intensity event? So I ended up designing an experiment for that.
Yeah, they fell down.
It took me 8 months to get approval for it. And but yeah, some of you know this experiment. I dropped people from a 150-foot tall tower in free fall backwards, and they were caught in a net below.
They weren't caught in a net.
They going 70 miles an hour when they hit the net. And what I measured, I built this device that's set on their wrist that essentially flashed information at them at a certain rate, and I could measure how fast they were actually taking in information and whether that changed, whether people actually see in slow motion during a life-threatening event. And by the way, it's super terrifying. I did it 3 times myself to make sure everything worked, and it was equally as terrifying all 3 times. But the thing is, so what we found is that, first of all, when we have people estimate with a stopwatch afterwards, okay, how long did it take? Picture from the time you were released to the time you landed in the net. And then we also have them watch other people drop, and we have them make an estimate about that too. It turns out that there's a big time distortion. You think that it was much longer when you're remembering your own event. But the surprising thing we found is that people were not able to see any faster during this life-threatening event. Their speed of taking in information was exactly the same as normal. And what that led us to conclude was that it's a trick of memory. When you're in a really scary event, a part of your brain called the amygdala kicks online, and it's like your emergency control center. And you write down memories on what's essentially a secondary memory track. You write down much denser memories than normal. So when you say, what just happened, what just happened, what just happened, you're now reading out much denser footage than normal. Normally, we don't remember much of anything. Your memory is like a sieve where everything's passing through. So what happens in an event like that is you write all this down, and that's actually what memory is for, right? When things are intense, that's when you want to write down what's happening. So when you read it back out, your brain's only choice is to make the estimate of, oh, that must have lasted longer because I have this and that memory, and I watched the hood crumple and the rearview mirror fall off and the expression on the other guy's face and so on. And so you end up concluding that it must have run in slow motion, but in fact it's just a trick of memory.
And there's so much more to understand about time perception, and hopefully we'll be doing more studies and research in it. This was really interesting about the way that neurodegeneration happens for certain people, and it does happen for others, but they stay socially active like nuns. This was really interesting that if you stay socially active and you stay active just in general with things to do, that you end up having less effects of the neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's on your brain, but if you're doing more of the, if you're retired and you're sitting around and you're not doing these things actively, that was interesting. You've built something called BrainCheck, which rapidly, does mobile neurocognitive testing, which right now there's no such thing as just having a doctor ping you and be like, hey, like, how's your attention doing? How's your short-term memory doing? Your focus? And so you've now been able to make this, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so we use a tablet and we have these, you just play these games for 5 minutes, but we're measuring 14 different things about what's happening under the hood, and like cognition, perception, decision making, and stuff like that. And so, yeah, we're able to detect things like the decline into mild cognitive impairment. Just in one sentence, the issue is that that's the stage before dementia, and that's the stage where all the pharmaceuticals are useful, and once you're fully demented, it's too late. But hardly anyone goes to the doctor when they should. It's only when they're fully demented that their family takes them to the doctor, and then they get diagnosed and it's too late. So the whole point I was trying to figure out is how could you do something at home so that you could actually track your cognitive state so that you just take it once every 3 months, your tablet pings you, tells you to take your brain check, and when you're starting to turn the corner. And we're now working with hospital systems to use this so that everyone who comes in gets the app, and then everyone takes the app every few months, and then the hospital pings you if something's going wrong. Yeah.
I think you said these words that within the school system, something that 5 words is create your own thing. Create your own thing. No, it's 4 words. There's 4 words, and it's so applicable. I think is that once you're learning, create your own thing. Go through that process of creativity that can be so crucial for the child to figure out exactly what they care about in the world and keep building and playing with tangibly. You in your book, the
Runaway Species.
This one is in Runaway Species. You're talking about bending, breaking, blending. You're talking about, and just unpack. I know you do that in a lot of your in your videos online, but just the principle of how.
I'll just give the 1 second version of it, which
every idea has a genealogy, which is so fascinating as well. We don't think about that too often. Is that you're looking at a chair, but there has been just thousands of years of people figuring out how to build chairs, and then you just tweaking it ever so slightly with this bending, breaking, blending. And this happens for every single idea that we see around us.
Yeah. You pretty much said it. Yeah. Here, I'll just say a few sentences. The romanticized idea that we all have is that there are ideas that can come out of the blue. Like when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, there was a reporter there who announced it as the Jesus phone because it seemed to have an immaculate conception. But in fact, the iPhone has a long history. IBM put out the IBM Simon in 1993, which was a touchscreen cell phone. So all these ideas, there's a very clear genealogy you can trace, and this is true of every great piece of art, every piece of literature, and so on. What we do is we are these vessels of our particular space and time in the world. So, you're born in whatever year, and you just absorb the world in where South Dakota, like that's what you absorb. And as a result, if you just look at something like why was 18th century American music so different than 18th century Japanese music and 18th century, Kenyan music. It's not that any of those musicians couldn't have played what the other ones were playing on their instrument, but it wouldn't make any sense to them because we are the results of our culture, where all the stuff we absorb, all the ideas that come in, we smash them together and remix them and do other things. But there's this spectrum between novelty and familiarity that's required for something to stick in our culture. So if I come up with a piece of music that's so familiar that it sounds like everything else, it won't stick. And if I come up with something that's so novel, that's completely crazy, no one gets it, it won't stick. So all artists have to find themselves in this range. You never know where it is. You have to sort of feel out the border of what's possible. where things have this balance of novelty and familiarity. But that's why cultures go off in different directions in different places.
Yep. That idea genealogy is so interesting. And then I want to see what your perspective is on this, because I kind of asked you about this, and it's this new part of this sort of way that I'm perceiving the way that we can mold minds into the world is and maximize their potential. We were talking about the way that the neural infrastructure of a child builds out from birth until about 2 years of age, and that I'm curious from your perspective, do you find any specific knowledge or specific networks of people that you would say are really important to get into a child's mind at a very young age to maximize its potential?
I happen to be a real cyber optimist on this point, which is I think despite all the complaints going on, we are living in such a terrific era where I think it's inevitable that the next generation is going to be a lot smarter than we are. And the reason is, I'm a little bit older than you are, but when I was growing up, if you wanted to know something, my mom would have to drive me down to the library, and I'd go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and hope the article was not too outdated and so on. Just the fact that kids are growing up with Wikipedia or being able to, run simulation things like Neeru Khosla's CK12 and so on, and a million things like this, and Khan Academy and so on. The fact that kids are able to say, oh, I'm curious about this, and then just get the best of humankind's knowledge at this moment, right there in the best possible present. I mean, look, I run into 13-year-olds all the time who say something super smart, and I say, how the heck did you know that? And they say, oh, I saw it on a TED Talk. And I think, gosh, when we grew up in Albuquerque or in South Dakota, it's like you were stuck with whatever homeroom teacher you had, who might really stink as a homeroom teacher, but now you can get the best person in the world giving the best talk of their life in 16 minutes. Here it is, the packaged, you watch it with some great slides. Anyway, the point is the opportunity to put things together is orders of magnitude above what we grew up with. And that's what I think is going to make the next generation so much smarter. The other thing to mention that's important is that we all grew up with, I know some people here are young, we all grew up with just in case knowledge. Like, just in case you ever need to know these 10 facts in Mongolian history, I'm going to teach them to you. And blah, blah.
You had to memorize the 7-digit phone number, or 10-digit number. That's
right. But I'm talking about knowledge. Like, just in case you need to know this fact about how this works, or this thing in chemistry or physics or whatever, like, I'm going to teach you because you might need it at some point. But what kids are growing up with now is just-in-time knowledge, where as soon as they're curious about something, they look it up, and there it is, and they run the simulation, they see whatever. They get to step inside of an atom or a solar system or whatever they're interested in at that moment. And it turns out from a neuroplasticity point of view, from what causes changes in the brain, you need the right cocktail of neurotransmitters to be present. And that is present when you are curious about something. When you are curious, hey, how does this work? Or how does this new type of paint work? Or how does whatever? Then when you get the answer in the context of your curiosity, then it sticks and you remember it.
That helps with the continuity of learning then. When you're curious, you get the information.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you're cyber optimist in that sense. Is there some sort of information or knowledge or people networks that you think are crucial for that? For maybe even objectively, children should be learning about this, like language, other thoughts?
It's an interesting question. There's a very, coming back to this point about how everyone is super different on the inside, kids from a very young age have totally different interests. And what's super cool, where we're heading towards rapidly with no one steering the ship, what we're heading towards is having the world's knowledge online, but you can get in there with whatever you're interested in. If you love baseball, or you love dancing, or you love whatever, surfing or whatever, you can say, gosh, what does RBE mean in baseball? Or how do I optimize the way I get on the wave? Or what is this thing? There are a million ways to get into the world's knowledge, and then you're in there and you're following your own interests. So I actually think the diversity of ways to get into the sphere of human knowledge is what's key, and we've achieved that accidentally.
Do you think that with the proliferation of exponential technology that it becomes information transfer, memetics, becomes more important than genetics?
Yes, and that actually has been true for our species for a long time now. Where as soon as you drop into the world, you're learning everything about your culture, but increasingly about, okay, what is every very clever thing that's happened in science up to this moment? Okay, cool. And so then we just come in at such a level ahead of where, for example, Albert Einstein came in, because now you can read all of Einstein, you can read it on Wikipedia and get a kind of understanding of it, and then that's where you're starting at the age of 9 or something.
You wrote this, and I think I've heard it a couple times prior to this as well, is that there are 3 times that you die: when your body stops functioning, when you physically get buried in the grave, and then when the last person says your name for the last time. And
it's literary fiction that I wrote. Yeah, just to be. I mean, I wasn't proposing that as a scientific thing. It was a piece of fiction.
I've heard that as like death in that sense, and so maybe this sort of prior to death, if you can pass 80 years in the developed world, or pending life extension technology, 120 years, or however long it may be, if you can potentially spread as much knowledge or wisdom or utility or happiness, or by whatever measure you want, through civilization, you can potentially prioritize memetics, prioritize this sort of knowledge transfer, rather than prioritize having a child or 2 children or 3 children. But I'm not saying they have to be so binarily bifurcated in that sense. They don't need to be, but now people are starting to see and weigh, especially millennials, Gen Z, are weighing out having families way later, if they even choose to have families. They want to make more impact in the world. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable, that you can leave your mark on the world in whatever way you want to. Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, we are victims of our evolutionary psychology, which is to say, we come to the table so wired to believe certain things are true, like that poop smells bad, and that apple pie smells good, and that other people's sexual organs that you didn't care about at all for your first 13 years are suddenly the most interesting thing in the world, and certain things feel great. But like all that stuff is just carved into your psychology. You have no choice but to think and believe that. Anyway, so having children is one of those things, and people find all kinds of ways to get around that, and to supersede that. But it's quite natural to have.
There was also another one of the studies where they were observing the males as they were observing females, and they were choosing females that had larger dilated pupils, and you weren't even conscious of you being sexually aroused and stimulated by that or not. I want to touch on some ethical concerns. I think these are very interesting. What are your thoughts about exponential technology exacerbating wealth inequality, and how do we ameliorate that?
We'll see what happens, but I think one of the advantages of exponential technology is that price gets driven down. Things get just cheaper and cheaper. So just by way of example, because I'm wearing this, the only option for a deaf person is a cochlear implant, which is $100,000.
Yep.
This is $150.
Yeah.
And so what that means is, for the world population of deaf people, now they can do something about it. But this is one story of 1,000 stories like that, where things just become cheap and easy.
You think like universal basic income to like unleash people's creativity and things like that?
I want to understand that better. I have friends who are in favor of that. What I'm not clear on is, if everyone gets this, why the prices of everything won't just go back up a little bit to essentially cancel it out. Maybe there's great arguments. I'd love to talk with people about that afterwards. But I think just generally with technology, and we've already seen this, right? Most of the world has toilets now. Most of the world, surprisingly, has cell phones now. Yeah. And you guys know this, but like the countries that couldn't afford personal computers and so on had just leapfrogged that era, to get cell phones now and doing everything. So anyway, the point is, as technology races forward, it just makes the whole world, all ships rise on that tide.
And I think you also said that companies like Kernel and Neuralink those are very far away, because it's going to be difficult to get like a neurosurgeon to want to connect you to the internet in that sense. It's a tough. We currently do see like neuroprosthetics where you can plug into the motor cortex. Someone that's paralyzed can use a robotic arm to go and grab things and shake people's hands and feed themselves, and that's very fascinating, really important. But you do think that superintelligence is quite far away, but we can potentially do these augmentations to our intelligence that are non-invasive in the meanwhile as we get there. I guess I want to know more about this, like this kind of like that you don't necessarily think that superintelligence is that big of a concern. Do you think it might be for your children then, if that's, you know, further down the line?
Do you mean the question of whether AI will become an existential threat to us, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not particularly worried about it, at least at the moment. And you know, ask me again in 10 years or 50 years, but I feel like AI right now, as everyone here knows, it can do super impressive things, but it's extraordinarily narrow.
Yeah.
And you know, a 3-year-old child is so much smarter in other ways, like being able to, you know, navigate a complex room or navigate social conversations or do a million things or figure out how to use a new toy or whatever. As you probably know, if you take, you know, a convolutional neural network and you train it up to be unbelievably good at distinguishing dog pictures from cat pictures, then you try to train it to, then you say, okay, now distinguish, you know, camels from penguins or whatever, it'll fail catastrophically. You have to train it completely over again. And people are working on this issue of, okay, how can you actually make it so that it will generalize and so on. But the fact is that the smartest neural nets are nowhere near as smart as a 3-year-old. And so I don't have any worries about that. The idea that a neural network would come up with the desire to take over the world or do whatever the thing is, and then come up with the smarts so that we don't just, you know, unplug it or whatever the thing is, seems very far-fetched to me.
Yeah, I think that we might have some of that as a pressing concern. I think rightfully so, just talking about the ethical concerns, like geopolitically, is I think very important so that we don't enter an arms race, we don't enter a robotic weaponry race either.
I'm afraid that's too late. I mean, all governments are putting tons of money into any company that comes to the Pentagon or the different militaries and says, we do AI, blah, blah, there's tons of money going into that. So unfortunately, that's too late. So I just don't think it'll yield.
Then it is really important to have those ethical conversations, just because if we're already saying that we are in an arms race, then it's difficult to non-envision a potential third world war. I mean, we gotta figure out how to work together in that sense to prevent that. Let's chat in just a little bit. There's a couple really pressing issues towards the end. Towards the end we will just check out these couple things that already exist with the future of brain stuff. This stuff's really cool. So we were talking about having a neural prosthetic and being able to move your hand if you're paralyzed. Brain preservation through cryonics. We have about 130, probably even more people that are currently just freezing themselves in hopes that at one day they can be brought back to life. The connectome is happening right now. So you're taking these very tiny, tiny slices of the brain and then mapping out and trying to create a 3-dimensional restructure. It's like a zettabyte of data per brain, which is as much data that's currently on the planet, which is...
It's now a quarter of our computational capacity, yeah.
A quarter of our and then there's the Blue Brain Project, which is simulating an entire brain. Eventually, we might be able to leave these brains and go and travel the solar system, go back in different realities. It's such exciting stuff. Fly, live underwater. Okay, in sum, you basically, what I really loved about sum was that you pretty much took simulated universes or simulated worlds, and you ran us through, like, what would it be like if you lived your life in reverse? What would it be like if you were born a different gender? What would it be like if you were multidimensional, if you had to experience everything in batches? So if you had to sleep for 30 years, and then if you had to, like, sit on the toilet for how long? 5 months? Have 7 months of sex? These very interesting sort of tales that you told. And I think that what you do when you do that is you creatively stimulate other people to get outside of our sort of the normative landscape of our world. And I love that about your mind and the way that you teach. And was that kind of like your intention, was to just expand our horizons?
Yeah, I think that science and literature are essentially trying to get at the same thing. It's but to my mind, literature picks up where science leaves off, which is past the realm of the things we can test. That's the realm of literature where you say, okay, look, what if this, what if that? The only difference is that in science you ask what if, and then you try to test them. So anyway, that was just my more speculative version of the same kind of thing. But really, that's all that we ever do in the laboratory is think, well, wait, we all grew up thinking this, but what if it's this other thing? and then that's progress when it's right.
Yeah, and that reminds me a lot of the idea of why we call the show simulation in many ways, is because we like to expand people's minds to what it would be like to live in simulated realities, or on other rocks orbiting stars with different sort of gravitational pulls, different evolutionary timelines, different amount of energy that's being given to the planet from the star, all this sort of the similar sort of idea. Now you're like, this is a collector. A collector is kind of like a simulator in a sense, is you're running these simulations and you're understanding what's happening in the simulations. We do love to ask the question about if you think that we're alone in the cosmos or not. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think exactly what all astrophysicists think about this, which is that it seems so terribly unlikely that we're alone, and yet it's so weird that we haven't heard a peep. So we're just stuck in this paradoxical silence. But just from the point of view of a biologist, the general view on biology is that if you take a rock and you simmer it at the right distance from a star long enough, you get sprouts with life, right? We've got all kinds of life forms on this planet. So it's very strange to think that that wouldn't be happening everywhere.
Do you think that we live in a simulation?
So this is actually a very old idea. Many of you probably know Rene Descartes was one who asked this question. He said, how do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat being stimulated by scientists to feel like I'm sitting in a chair and I'm having a conversation and so on? And his conclusion was that you can't really know that. And so he made a very important step in philosophy where he said, je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. And what he meant is, there's somebody asking this question. There's somebody asking this question of, am I a brain in a vat? And so I exist, whether I'm a brain in a vat or I'm me or whatever. There's some me that's there. So that was an important step. But the question of whether a simulation, that was sort of, I would say that was sort of buried in philosophy departments for a while. But now, just now, especially in Silicon Valley, that's becoming a really interesting question, because we can build simulations that are so detailed and terrific. So it seems, of course, totally plausible that a future civilization is building a simulation where you seem like you're in this very beautiful room and you're talking with people, and and it wouldn't even be that hard to simulate this, especially if there's nothing going on outside. Like, in other words, your house is not being simulated right now. None of the details. But as soon as you step outside, then the street gets stimulated again and so on.
None of the Earth is rendered. Only the area of the Earth that you are in is rendered.
Exactly. And that was one of my stories in Sum, actually, is that only the rendering happens where you're seeing it. Yeah. But the point is, you could run that almost on a cell phone. And so that's why this idea has been taken more and more seriously as a possibility. Now, the question is, how would we ever get it out of the realm of a philosophical question into a scientific one? We don't know the answer to that yet, unless there's a particular sign, like one of the transistors in the simulation burns out and suddenly, all the plants disappear or something. And
well, it might be deja vu. It might be something related.
Yeah, I don't really buy deja vu as a thing that...
Check this out. Well, virtual reality extrapolated 100 years, completely indistinguishable. You're just jumping into the world. It only takes you... Your body only lives 10 seconds, but you live 80 years in the virtual world. And so you completely forget that you're in the virtual world and you're just living in it, and then you're done, and then you just jump into the next simulation, whatever you want. I mean, that's not really that far away. I think I'll be able to experience that sometime in my life in those simulated worlds, and I'll be able to design simulated worlds. I'll be able to go and observe how the Earth has evolved, how other planets have evolved around stars, go and jump between them, that kind of stuff.
Sure. The only question is whether you could actually experience the 80 years in 10 seconds. You probably couldn't, because you are a big giant creature who's made up of these trillions of cells, and that means your time runs at a certain pace, and so you can't shove information in there that fast.
Yeah, but that's good. So last question: what do you think is the most beautiful thing in the world?
Love.
Love ranks, maybe that would be right. I mean, obviously, I think, especially in this context, just because we're talking about this, the scientific pursuit, meaning just trying to figure out what is going on around us, because as relates to this issue of whether we're in a simulation, like, you don't really remember getting here. As far as you know, you've just sort of always been an existing creature. Like, you don't remember turning on as such, and you're told that someday you will not be here anymore, but we have a very poor understanding of how we got here. We're just sort of, oh yeah, oh here I am, and we're just surrounded by massive mysteries, like the size of the cosmos and the fact that is there life, you know, the fact that we haven't been contacted by anyone, and so. But even very basic mysteries, like, you know, in my very narrow study about the brain, it's all mysteries, like how is consciousness produced? How do you put together, you know, billions of neurons that get this private subjective experience? What is sleep? Why do we sleep at night? Why do we shut off? What is intelligence? How do you measure? Why do we have emotions? But there's a million questions. And so the scientific pursuit is a way of saying, okay, look, I'm going to think about a possible answer to this question, and I'm going to test it, and 5 other people are going to think of other possible answers. We're all going to fight and debate in the literature, and we're going to say, hey, wow, there's something that none of us thought of. And so as a civilization, we're creeping forward that way, but it's very new. Like the last several hundred years is really what we've been, the time that we've started doing that systematically. So it's a very beautiful time that we're in.
It gives us a better, more strong, real lens to observe reality with over time. Yeah.
Or a more confusing one.
Or a more confusing one.
Right, if you grew up 1,000 years ago and you were told, look, here's the scoop, it's Jesus, it's this, it's that, whatever, fine. It's pretty easy to understand. Now we write giant books. I mean, there's this book in our field called Principles of Neuroscience, which is that big. And, you know, my joke on it is that it's not, it shouldn't be called Principles of Neuroscience, because if it were principles, it would be like the size of a pamphlet or something. Yeah. But the fact, it's just a core dump of all our knowledge. But the point is, as we get more and more and more knowledge about everything, it gets more and more confusing. I mean, it took me 7 years to write this cognitive neuroscience textbook because there's that much data out there. Yeah. So anyway, it may not make it clearer to us what our reality is, but at least it's navigating it along a way that's testable and yeah.
Well, David Eagleman, a man of so many different talents and knowledges and wisdoms that have been communicated through all of these different books, as well as now an entrepreneur helping people that are deaf, new NeoSensory, making new senses, BrainCheck, continuing to profess as well, and just being a major influence through media and culture on our lives, inspiring the next generation. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Alan.
It's been such a pleasure. Really,
Thank you.
Really, really
great.